Good morning and welcome to the third and final day of the CNAS Annual National Security Conference. I'm Richard Fontaine, the CEO of the Center for New American Security. And I'm really pleased to kick off this last day with a conversation with Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor to President Biden. Jake has been National Security Advisor since the inception of this administration and served in the same role for Vice President Biden, also served as Director of Policy Planning in the Obama administration, as Deputy Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and a lot more besides. So there's nobody better placed to share thoughts about how the administration is conceptualizing its approach to the world when there's a lot going on. So Jake, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Pleased to have you here. For those watching the conversation, if you want to join in, you can submit questions using the chat on our official conference website. That's conference.cnas.org, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So Jake, let me start with the war in Ukraine, which obviously is on everyone's minds. The administration's been making major efforts to help the Ukrainians resist the Russian onslaught. When asked the big question, how does this end? The administration will often say, well, it's up to the Ukrainians. We're not going to tell the Ukrainians what the term should be and all this stuff. But surely the administration has to have a view on what constitutes a better or worse or more realistic or less realistic sort of end, whether that's a difference between fighting to February 24th lines or liberating all of Crimea or something like that. So how are you thinking about where this is headed and what the sort of realistic outcome might be of the war there?
Well, especially given how dynamic things are on the battlefield, and also the fact that we are in support of a sovereign country that is ultimately going to chart its own destiny, we have in fact refrained from laying out what we see as an end game, what we see as objectives. So we've been focused on what we can do today, tomorrow, next week to strengthen the Ukrainians' hand to the maximum extent possible, first on the battlefield and then ultimately at the negotiating table. We think this will have to end through diplomacy, and we want the Ukrainians to be in the strongest position possible when that diplomacy gets engaged in a fuller way. And from our perspective, that has to be the thrust and purpose of our policy. So diplomacy to what end is a perfectly reasonable question, but right now, sitting here today in June, our view is that that's something the Ukrainians will have to shape through an internal democratic discourse in their country. And our job is not to define those terms or define those objectives at the end. Our job is to give them the tools they need to put themselves in the strongest position possible. So we'll continue to do that with our partners. As the president said in the op-ed that he wrote in the New York Times, we're not going to be pressing them to make territorial concessions. We think that's inconsistent with international law and is just frankly wrong. But we are going to support and consult with them as they think about how they want to approach a negotiated outcome with the Russians. And for the time being, supporting them in that means supporting them through the steady provision of weapons and intelligence, which yesterday we just announced another $1 billion of.
Yeah, so I have a question on that. The amount of weapons that the United States and other countries have provided is huge, quick. It's probably unprecedented in scope to have the transfer of that level of weapons over such a short time to another country, particularly when that country is in the middle of a war. There's talk now, everyone has learned the term HIMARS, which they probably didn't know even a few days ago, other than people in the sort of wonky military realm. But there's a lot of talk about the Ukrainian request for 60 or for 100 HIMARS. These are these truck-borne rocket launchers, and the administration providing 4 or so, and the UK providing some and things like that. Is there a gap between what the Ukrainians are asking for in terms of weapons that would be able to hit beyond the Russian lines and what the administration is prepared to provide?
Well, first, it's the Ukrainians' job to ask for as many as they can possibly get their hands on, and it's our job to deliver to them to the extent that we feel there are trained personnel and the capacity to actually put those to use in an effective way. And so we have given an initial 4. And actually, we have moved the training at a really rapid and efficient pace so that those can be deployed onto the battlefield in short order. As you said, the UK are providing systems. The Germans have said they will provide systems. And in the next drawdown package from the United States, we anticipate that there will be further delivery of systems as well. So we have to take this step by step. And one of the key considerations in how we deliver these systems is how many can be absorbed effectively onto the battlefield. These are highly sophisticated systems that require real training. We've trained an initial cadre of Ukrainians to be able to use them, but as you increase the number of systems, you obviously have to increase the number of personnel being prepared to use them. So that will be a process that unfolds over the course of the coming weeks and months. And we think that over time, through close consultations with the Ukrainians at both the professional and the political level, we'll come to a good understanding about how many of these HIMARS we end up giving. President Biden spoke with President Zelensky yesterday at some length. They actually went through in detail the Ukrainian requests and the Western fulfillment of those requests on a number of systems: artillery, MLRS, armored personnel carriers, ammunition, et cetera. And we feel good about where we are.
Okay, great. Let me step back and ask you about kind of the nature of the global competition that we're in. The president and other folks in the administration have often framed a contest of democracies versus autocracies, where there's really a fight for the preservation of our democratic systems and our way of life and so forth. To what degree is that kind of the animating way of understanding what we're in the world, and how does that square with the fact that on Russia, for example, there are lots of democracies that don't have the view on sanctions, for example, that we have India, most of the Western Hemisphere, and then on China, there are autocracies that have the view that we do have, Vietnam or something, or the need to deal with a country like Saudi Arabia, where the president's going next month, which would seem to complicate this sort of framing. But how do you and the president see that?
I think, first of all, to answer your direct question, how much is this an animating principle? It is deeply animating for the president and for the administration's foreign policy. It's instinctive for him. It's rooted in a long history of engagement on foreign policy, going back decades as a senator, as vice president, and now as president. And it meets the moment we're in today, where both the acute geopolitical challenge we face, Russia, and the long-term pacing challenge we face in China are autocratic systems that are looking to remake the international order in their image. And so at two levels, the president approaches the question of democracies versus autocracies. One is about the system itself and proving the viability, durability, and success of the system. And he often talks about how democracies have to show that they can deliver for their citizens and that it is a superior form of governance to autocracies at this critical moment. That's a little less about foreign policy, although there are obviously foreign policy implications to it. The second is that we have built an international rules-based order that fundamentally reflects a set of values and principles that create a healthy environment for democracies to flourish. And we want to protect and update that order in ways consistent with our values. Does that mean we only work with democracies to do it? Of course not. And that's never been a part of our proposition. If you go back to the Reagan era or the Kennedy era or the Eisenhower era, and you look at a time when the forces of freedom were seeking to define a better future for the world against a major autocratic competitor, we didn't write off all countries that weren't democratic, nor will we do that today. Whether we're talking about Southeast Asia or the Middle East or other parts of the world, we're prepared to work with many different kinds of countries, provided they are prepared to step up and support an overall effort to defend the rules-based order from the kinds of assaults that are being launched against it by some of the major geopolitical competitors of the United States. And so I think there is nothing inconsistent with saying we want a balance of power that favors freedom in the world and saying we're prepared to work with a range of partners to be able to achieve that strategic outcome. And we've invested in relationships with the core democracies of the world through the G7 and other formats. And we've also invested in relationships with Vietnam, with Gulf countries and others. And we think that there is a long bipartisan tradition of that has borne results for American foreign policy.
And presumably, if non-democracies wish to oppose the cardinal transgression against the rules-based international order, which is territorial conquest by force, then we would welcome that.
Of course.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by, in a way, that's a more concrete way of saying my more abstract statement about countries that line up to defend the rules-based international order.
Right. Countries
that say, no, we're not going to allow this kind of rampant revisionism or this transgression of fundamental principles. Do we want to see them engaged in political reform and moving down the track towards more open and democratic societies? Of course, but are we prepared to work with them in service of defending these core principles? We are. And on the flip side, while it's true there are democratic countries in the world that haven't signed up to sanctions, I would point out that at the UN General Assembly, you mentioned Latin America, we had 141 countries condemning the action, the brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And most of the Western Hemisphere lined up to support that. And when the president was just at the Summit of the Americas, the leaders had an extended discussion about Ukraine, and there was actually general contempt for what Putin has done there, even if we have a different view on some of the tools like sanctions.
How much, if at all, is this issue divisive in our close relationships? So take India as an example, which has not adopted the sanctions, buying oil from Russia, abstained at the UN and so forth, and yet it's been a bipartisan project dating back to the Clinton administration to forge closer ties with India across the full range of activities. Does that harm or hinder those ambitions to forge close relations with India, or is it just a difference of opinion that we can manage easily?
It's certainly a difference in perspective that we have to be direct with our Indian counterparts about how we view the situation, how we would encourage them to, over time, take a different perspective themselves. But they're a sovereign, democratic nation. They will make their own decisions, and we're not here to lecture them or to insist on a certain outcome or else. We're having, I would say, a deep, respectful, and strategic dialogue with India, starting with the president and the prime minister, who have spoken frequently by phone and just met a couple of weeks ago in Tokyo. And we're playing the long game here. We are investing in a relationship that we are not going to judge by one issue, even if that issue is quite consequential, but rather that we are going to judge over the fullness of time as we try to work to convergence on the major strategic questions facing our two countries. On one of those questions, how to deal with the challenge posed by China, there's much more convergence today, right, and that is important to U.S. foreign policy. On the question of Russia, obviously we have different historical perspectives, different muscle memories, but we feel confident that the dialogue we have going with India right now will bear fruit over time in a way that is not about forcing them to change or demanding things of them, but rather is the kind of iterative approach in a strategic relationship that, tended well, will lead to better outcomes.
So if we were having this conversation last fall, we would have started with China and probably struggled to talk about other issues. Having it today, it's hard to talk about issues not related to Russia and the Russian war, and the reasons for this are entirely obvious. But the world goes on, and the priority that the administration has set on the Indo-Pacific as a region and China as the long-term challenge endures while you have to deal with Russia. And this involves prioritization and trade-offs and things like this, right? So, the U.S.-ASEAN summit, you have the leaders come, and there's for the first time, we should add, because it's a great diplomatic initiative, and $150 million of U.S. investment in Southeast Asia pledge. The very same week, the Congress is getting ready to do $40 billion for Ukraine. Very good reasons for both of those things, but it does seem to put some tension in how do we balance our interests and our activities and our resources across these regions. So what's the answer? How do you do that?
Yeah, it kind of comes down to what is the purpose of the resources or assistance. At the end of the day, if you're going to supply large amounts of high quality weaponry, it's going to cost a lot of money, direct budget support. So that's why you get the kinds of numbers in the Ukraine supplemental. In the case of Southeast Asia, what we're really trying to stimulate is a long-term economic relationship rooted in private sector investment, not in massive cash transfers from the American Treasury to these countries. And that means taking relatively smaller amounts of money and leveraging significant private sector investment to add up to billions and ultimately tens of billions of dollars that will do everything from strengthen our supply chains to helping these countries with clean energy transition, to helping them move into an even more high technology phase. And actually, when the president goes to the G7 next weekend, he will be launching a partnership for global infrastructure, physical, health, and digital infrastructure that we think can provide an alternative to what the Chinese are offering, to the tune of tens and ultimately hundreds of billions of dollars when you add in what our G7 partners are going to do as well. And that's at relatively modest direct budget allocations from the United States. So fundamentally, it's about different tools in different places. And we think that this model of US government dollars leveraging huge private sector dollars can pay massive dividends across the Indo-Pacific. And we intend for this to be one of the hallmarks of the Biden administration foreign policy over the remainder of his tenure.
Great. A couple of specific questions. So Taiwan, the president now 3 times has said that he would defend Taiwan, and then the administration, including him, have then said, well, the policy hasn't changed, but I will defend seems different than we may defend. So what is the policy of, is it strategic ambiguity that we may or may not defend Taiwan if attacked?
Our policy is the same with respect to Taiwan as it has been through a bipartisan consensus over the course of multiple presidencies. It's the One China policy, the 3 joint communiques, the Taiwan Relations Act, 6 assurances, and fundamentally, the entire thrust and purpose of our approach, our diplomatic, defense, security, intelligence approach to Taiwan is about ensuring that the day never comes where the question is called as to whether or not we have to defend Taiwan, because we will have effectively deterred it. That is what our policy is all about. And that policy is the same today as it was in the last administration and in the administration before that. Now, you've just highlighted a kind of tension within the policy. I would just offer to you that going back to the early 1970s, when the first joint communique was negotiated between the Nixon administration and Mao, there has been a tension inherent in Taiwan policy. The very notion of the One China policy, the 3 joint communiques, the Taiwan Relations Act, the 6 assurances, contains multitudes. And so I don't regard that as a bug in our Taiwan policy, but rather as a feature. And it is a feature that has actually served us relatively well in terms of managing a difficult relationship and maintaining peace and stability across the strait. The challenge I think we face today is that Beijing is increasingly engaged in activities that are threatening peace and stability across the strait. And we believe that it is very important to stand firmly on principle and against those kinds of destabilizing activities, and that's what we're trying to do.
There's a question from the audience. Ryan basically asks what you and Young Jushi talked about, but it's more articulate than that. Can you tell us whether there's any consensus between the US and China on the Ukraine war or on North Korea's possible nuclear test?
So on the Ukraine war, what I would say is that we have not seen China move forward with any form of direct military assistance to Ukraine, and we've not seen them undertake systematic efforts to help the Russians evade the sanctions and export controls. Yesterday, I saw a very interesting juxtaposition of 2 articles that came out at the same time reporting on the call between President Xi and President Putin, when President Putin called Xi to wish him a happy birthday. One was from the AP, the other was from the Wall Street Journal. The headline of one was, China offers support to Russia for Ukraine war. The other headline was, China withholds support to Ukraine for to Russia for the Ukraine war. Right. And you could read the readout kind of both ways, going back to the conversation we were just having about Taiwan. It's, has China come out and voted against Russia in either the Security Council or the General Assembly? No.
Right.
Has China gone out and said, look, we're behind Russia on this thing, they're doing the right thing? No. They're taking a very careful approach to this. And on the issues that we have pressed them particularly hard on, the provision of assistance, the evasion of sanctions, we believe that China has not taken steps that cross those lines. On North Korea, we have expressed our concern that North Korea is preparing to conduct another nuclear test. We have said that publicly. We have communicated that to China, and the proof will be in the pudding. Let's see how things play out. But both of these subjects featured prominently in our discussions on Monday in Europe, the discussion I had with my counterpart Yang, as well as an extended discussion on Taiwan too, where we communicated our view that we need to see the maintenance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, and I raised my concerns about what China is up to.
So moving to Iran, many observers, myself included, thought we would probably be back in the JCPOA by now. Obviously, there's a dilemma over the Quds Force designation, and this is after the Russians tried to, sort of leverage their own sanctions and claim that they should get an exemption there and things like that. So, as we sit here today, do you have a sense of where the Iran nuclear deal is heading, particularly against the backdrop of dismantling IAEA cameras and increasing the uranium enrichment levels?
Yeah. So, the steps that Iran is taking with respect to enrichment and respect to these verification mechanisms, the removal of the cameras, for example, these are fundamentally unhelpful steps, and we are responding by ourselves, increasing the economic pressure on Iran. We have done additional designations. There will be more to come on that score. But all of that, from our side, and the Iranians have said the same thing about what they've done on the cameras, could be dealt with in the context of a compliance for compliance return to the JCPOA. That remains a live possibility. There is a deal on the table that the Iranians could take that would serve our interests, our allies' interests, and that would, from our perspective, provide Iran with what they had been offered under the Iran nuclear deal. Now, the Iranians may not be able to get there, in which case we will work with our allies and partners in the region, in Europe and elsewhere, to continue to sharpen the choice for them, to continue to impose costs and consequences for that. But our view is that we should leave aside the extraneous issues, focus on the core of the JCPOA, and go back to it. And really the ball is in Iran's court on this, and we'll see what they do over the coming days.
And then sort of moving around the globe a little more, so Turkey. Turkey is had some odd alignments, been constructive at some times and frustrating at other times, democratic rollback at home, and an ally. And so complicated situation. Heading into the Madrid summit, the very welcome news, I think, to many people that Sweden and Finland wish to apply for and become the newest members of NATO. Turkey, President Erdogan sort of suggesting that at a minimum there'll be some price that he might be able to extract from the allies or from Sweden and Finland. Do you expect Sweden and Finland to become members of NATO? And how do you see Turkey's role in that and more broadly?
I do expect Finland and Sweden to become members of NATO. Turkey has raised concerns. Those concerns largely relate to the issue of terrorism and the PKK. The Swedes and the Finns have both indicated they are prepared to address Turkey's concerns. There have been high-level engagements between the Swedes and Finns and the Turkish president and his team. A couple of days ago in Europe, I actually sat down with my Turkish counterpart, the National Security Advisor, to talk through the way ahead on this. And yesterday, there were high-level engagements between NATO and the Turkish government. I can't give you an exact timeline on the resolution of these issues, but what I can tell you is there is a commitment on all sides to figure out a way forward to ultimately produce this historic outcome where these two countries with a long history of neutrality join the NATO alliance, and in doing so, massively enhance the overall capacity of the alliance, because these are two strong security partners with critical geographical realities that will help us be able to deal with a Russian threat that is going to remain acute for the foreseeable future.
One of the things that the administration, that the president have emphasized is the connection between everyday Americans and foreign policy for the middle class, but I think more broadly, the idea that what happens in our foreign policy and outside our shores actually matters to the everyday lives of Americans. Some of this gets lost when you're sitting around talking with think tankers about, rules-based international order and great power competition in our world and things like that. But how do you think about, so take maybe two of the big questions here that are kind of out there. One is China's ascendance and its illiberalism. And then the other is Russia's violent transgression of international rules. For someone who doesn't do this stuff for a living, what does that actually mean in their future if the United States were to take a different position on these things, to not care about these things, to not push back against Russian aggression, to not try to shape the world in which China's technology or its economics or its political choices become more dominant? So can you give a sense of just how you think about that connection to the lives of everyday Americans?
Well, just starting with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, if the United States let that stand without challenge or check, it would send a message to other would-be aggressors, including China, that they could do the same thing. And then all of a sudden you're looking at major countries with significant militaries taking territory, and in doing so, destabilizing not just the quote-unquote rules-based international order, but the global economy in really profound and fundamental ways that end up hurting everyday people here in the United States. If war and conflict starts, and wars of conquest in particular, start becoming the norm rather than the flagrant exception, the impacts on everything from food to energy to semiconductors and high technology to basic supply chains would be profound, and the hit on the lives and livelihoods of average people in the United States would be amplified, magnified exponentially over time. So drawing a line now to try to ensure stability will end up sustaining or helping sustain a longer period of peace and prosperity in the future. On the question of what happens if China comes to dominate the world or become the most powerful, influential actor economically, technologically, politically, three things. First, the space for free expression, free association, free engagement across democracies starts to get squeezed as the world gets more and more safe for the kind of surveillance-based repressive authoritarianism that is practiced by the Chinese government. Second, the economic rules of the road, we're dealing with an uneven playing field right now that we're trying to remedy, would become even more out of whack in favor of China and at the expense of American workers and businesses. And that would have profound consequences for us. And then third and finally, our ability to solve big problems that matter to Americans, COVID, climate, nuclear nonproliferation. If the United States is not playing a central role in rallying the world to solve those problems that end up coming back home to roost for people in the United States, counterterrorism being another one, and that's left to China or is left to no one, we're all worse off. So I think across all of these elements, people in my hometown, in yours, have to think about not so much what is the immediate consequence of Putin taking a town in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, but rather what are the long-term ripple and radiating effects of these kinds of aggressive moves by authoritarian superpowers. And when you play out that world, it is a world that is darker and harsher for American families, and it's one we need to stand against and in favor of a vision for the world that actually delivers a better life for people. And that's the core of what we're trying to do every day through a turbulent and crisis-laden international landscape.
Jake, thank you for joining us. Thanks so much. Thanks for everybody for tuning in. We're going to let the National Security Advisor get back to the people's work, but we're really grateful for you sharing your thoughts and insights with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
and for those who are tuning in, we'll be back at 10 a.m., so just in a few minutes, with a Safe at Home session featuring Assistant Attorney General Matt Olson and CNAS Gates Senior Fellow Carrie Cardero. So stick around for that. Thanks again, Jake.
Thanks.
The People's Bank of China, China's central bank, is developing the digital yuan, the first digital version of a fiat currency from a major economy. The digital yuan will likely strengthen the Chinese Communist Party's domestic digital authoritarianism. As countries look for models to manage central bank money, Beijing's digital yuan will bring about new standards in the global financial system that risk privacy and governance principles. So far, we know that the digital yuan system will have a two-tier structure, with the central bank managing the back end and state banks and private companies facilitating everyday transactions. It will not be blockchain-based. The most groundbreaking and alarming feature of the digital yuan is controllable anonymity, which allows China's central bank to see nearly all real-time transactions. China's central bank wants to harness the market share and technological innovation of private firms and gain direct access to Chinese consumers' financial data. It aims to shape monetary policy, monitor illegal activity, and curb corruption. The Chinese Communist Party will likely leverage the system to surveil Chinese citizens. The digital yuan system would make it easier for the party to cut off financial access of any individual. Pilot tests have been underway since mid-2020. If successful, China may gain an edge over the United States in financial technology innovation. China will make the digital yuan available for wider use during the Beijing Winter Olympics in February 2022. U.S. policymakers must address the digital yuan's potential to further Beijing's coercive power and influence in the global financial system. America must adapt to the evolving payments space, counter the digital yuan's threats to political and economic liberty, and ensure that innovation in financial technology does not advance China's digital authoritarianism.
Good morning and welcome to this special conference edition of our speaker series, Safe at Home at the Center for a New American Security. I'm Carrie Cordero. The Safe at Home series is intended to bring greater attention to the safety and security issues that affect Americans on a daily basis. As democracy is under strain in many parts of the world, it's important that we regularly and persistently highlight how democracy delivers for people in their daily lives. And I was enlightened to hear Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, just in his conversation preceding ours with CEO Richard Fontaine, talk about this exact concept of democracy delivering for people. One of the things that it has to deliver is a reasonable degree of safety and security. And so in this series so far, we've been talking about political violence against government officials, pandemic preparedness and response, climate-related emergency management. Later this year in the series, we're going to host a discussion on the legislative and policy developments to reduce the threat of mass shootings and gun violence across the country. And this series is going to continue to dive deep into the efforts that policymakers, leaders, and operators at the federal level and all across the country are engaging in to protect the country consistent with our laws and values. Today, we're discussing terrorism and domestic terrorism in particular. And so I'm delighted to welcome Assistant Attorney General for National Security, Matt Olson, to the conversation. Matt, welcome.
Thanks, Carrie. Great to be here with you and everybody.
I want to give you a few words, give our audience a few words about Assistant Attorney General Olson's background and the experience and knowledge that he brings to his role as Assistant Attorney General. He leads the National Security Division of the Justice Department, whose mission is to combat terrorism, espionage, cybercrime, and other threats to national security. He previously served as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center and was also the general counsel of the NSA, the National Security Agency. For 18 years, Matt worked as a career attorney in the Justice Department, as a prosecutor, and in a wide array of leadership positions in the national security arena. And in 2006, back when I was at DOJ, he helped establish the National Security Division and served as the first career Deputy Assistant Attorney General for National Security. So he has a long and distinguished experience at the Justice Department and across the national security community, and he brings thoughtfulness and expertise to this conversation. A few notes just of virtual housekeeping today. This conversation is live and is being live streamed on CNAS's website and on our social media channels. On our website, you can enter questions for me and Assistant Attorney General Olson, and you can also post questions on Twitter using the hashtag CNAS 2022. Our team will make sure that I see the questions, and I'll be looking to incorporate them throughout our conversation. So please don't wait until the end to send in your questions. If you have questions and you want to participate in the conversation, please send them in and we'll work them into the conversation as it makes sense. So Matt, again, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us today at the CNAS annual conference. And let's dig in to what the Justice Department, the National Security Division, and the administration are doing to respond to the increased threat from domestic terrorism in particular, and other types of domestic violent extremism that threaten Americans all around the country. Just to set this up, last June, as you know, and so for our audience's information, the National Security Council released the first ever domestic terrorism national strategy. It's the first time any administration has had a specific national strategy totally focused on domestic terrorism and countering domestic violent extremism. Over the course of the last year, the FBI director, the Secretary of Homeland Security, when they have said in public testimony, when they've been in public testimony, they've said that domestic terrorism is actually the #1 threat that they are looking at from a inside the homeland domestic perspective. In your role as Assistant Attorney General for National Security, you've got a bird's eye view to all of the threats, foreign and domestic. So can you give our audience, just to start, a sense of, from where you sit, how do you see the domestic terrorism threat where does it fit into the landscape of all the things that you're seeing?
Yeah, thank you for that broad question to start us off, Carrie. It's great, again, to be here with you and to be part of this conference. And, as you noted, you and I go back a few years to my time in the Justice Department at the beginning of the National Security Division in 2006. And when you and I worked together on FISA matters, basically, and foreign intelligence collection. And, reflecting back on that time, in answer to your question, it is really interesting to think about how much has changed in the terms of the threat landscape. When we were together at the beginning of the National Security Division, when it was started in 2006, the focus really was, first and foremost, international terrorism. We were really all about Al-Qaeda, right? And the threat from Al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups, international terrorism, and how it might affect us inside the United States. In fact, the National Security Division was really born, much like other changes in the government at DHS, the creation of DHS, the creation of the Office of Director of National Intelligence, born of the post 9/11 transformation of the government. So that was the focus when I was in the National Security Division at its beginning. Now, returning to the division several, these years later, in 2021, so I've been here about 8 months. It's remarkable how much the threat landscape has changed. It's really as complex and dynamic as I've seen it in my time working on national security over the past plus 15 years plus. So, of course, we are still focused on international terrorism. Al-Qaeda, ISIS are still part of the landscape and require an unwavering level of attention. The biggest change, though, in terms of terrorism, is this rise in domestic terrorism that we've seen over the past several years. As you noted, the White House issued a national strategy, the first of its kind, focused on domestic terrorism. Actually, 1 year and 1 day ago, yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of that strategy, to really focus a whole of government effort on domestic terrorism. It began, as it should, and as we've learned is needed, with an intelligence assessment by the government and the community about what the domestic terrorism threat landscape looks like, to drive the insights of that strategy, which have multiple pillars. Our focus really within the Justice Department is on disruption. That's where we have tools and authorities that we can bring to bear on the domestic terrorism challenge. So your question is sort of, how do I see the domestic terrorism threat in the constellation of threats that we face? And I'll just put a pin in the idea that, or the reality that we are also dealing, of course, with nation state threats in a way that we haven't over the past 20 years. So that is also a huge focus for us now in the National Security Division. But just in terms of terrorism, the intelligence community has been very clear over the past few years that the greatest threat is from single individuals, lone actors, or small cells who are either inspired by international groups like ISIS or are part of domestic terrorism or domestic violent extremist ideologies. And what we've seen is there's really two driving ideologies. One is racially motivated or ethnically motivated hatred, white supremacist in particular, that has been among the most lethal sources of ideological threats or ideologies that drive the threat. And then anti-government or anti-authoritarian. I think, and the numbers are on the rise in terms of the number of domestic violent extremists that we are facing. In fact, the number of domestic violent extremist cases that the FBI has opened has more than doubled over the past 2 years, just to give you some sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
let me ask you a follow-up. So in terms of the national strategy, so we've got this new strategy. I've been at a think tank a few years now, so we all love a good strategy and a good policy. But the old operational lawyer in me wants to know, how are we going to operationalize this? The strategy is, we're a year into it now, as you mentioned, year and a day. So can you talk about just a little bit, how in the Justice Department, in the National Security Division, how are you operationalizing that strategy to implement it?
Yeah, so again, like any good strategy, it's got an implementation plan, a strategic implementation plan, a SIP, to those of you in the audience who are planners and have been through this. So with detailed requirements and taskings to all of the agencies who are involved. For us in the Justice Department, one component of it is, I mean, it may sound mundane, but it's really important. That's data collection. It's understanding, to try to inform our understanding of the threat. Like, how many cases do we have? Where are those cases coming from? How are we categorizing those cases? Do we have a rigorous taxonomy for characterizing the nature of the threat? And that's been a big part of what we've done. We've built, to operationalize that, we've built processes, and we've actually dedicated resources in terms of people to the collection and analysis of the data. We actually are working with Homeland Security, of course. We're also working with NCTC in doing that. Understanding that threat is what's the first step in trying to combat it. And also in terms of operationalizing the strategy, we've always handled domestic terrorism cases in the National Security Division. We have a counterterrorism section of about 40 attorneys dedicated to counterterrorism. They do both IT and DT, international and domestic terrorism. But I thought it was necessary to increase our focus on domestic terrorism given the nature of the threat. So I announced earlier this year, and then formally stood up just last month, a dedicated domestic terrorism unit within our counterterrorism section. This group consists of prosecutors. It also consists of some data analysts, and the focus is on a number of facets of the challenge. One is coordinating, and in some cases directly being involved in the prosecution of DT cases, building up that expertise around domestic terrorism cases, which tend to bring some unique issues to the fore, particularly around protected activity, First Amendment protected activity, and the like. It's also
so there is a resource. There is a resource and sort of a second chair and or a partner with the U.S. Attorney's offices that are bringing these cases.
Exactly, the full range of activities, whether it's full partner or just as a resource. Look, I mean, the reality is, and just to dig into that point, because you're an insider, right? So you understand it, and maybe a lot of the audience does as well, right? How this works. But when it comes to the international terrorism side, we have approval authority over certain charges, like material support to terrorism, and we don't necessarily, and we haven't to date, but we are working toward getting a similar type of a role when it comes to domestic terrorism, for the goal of advancing coordination and consistency in building a national program around domestic terrorism. Mm-hmm. And look, when it comes to domestic terrorism, sometimes those charges are charges that are really the bread and butter of a U.S. Attorney's office. So if you have a domestic violent extremist who commits a weapons violation, or right, say fraud, like those cases, U.S. Attorney's offices know how to prosecute those cases. We're there to help them and support them, but they don't necessarily need main justice involvement to the same degree as you might find on the international terrorism side with a material support charge that involves classified information and a lot of intelligence community equities. But when you talk about cases like like January 6th and the complex conspiracy cases and charges involving seditious conspiracy, for example, these are really complicated charges. They do involve national level equities. It is important, and in fact, we are directly involved in working closely with the DC U.S. Attorney's Office in that massive investigation and prosecution. So that's a little bit of some bureaucratic insight into to your question about how we're operationalizing this. But the DT unit will be exactly as you would imagine in terms of it will be involved in prosecutions, but it will also be involved in training and guidance, sort of classic main justice role, as well as supporting the data collection and analysis that will help us better understand the nature of the threat.
Great. I want to come back to a little bit later in our discussion. I want to come back to the authorities and like you mentioned, seditious conspiracy, some of the authorities that are available to prosecute domestic terrorism. But before we get there, just one more thought on sort of how the Justice Department works. If we can back the lens up from NSD and talk about the coordination within the Department of Justice and FBI and the components a little bit more broadly. One of the things that strikes me that's different about the present domestic terror, the way that the Justice Department would approach the current domestic violent extremist and domestic terrorism threat is that it actually involves a much broader array of legal authorities and of DOJ components than we needed to deal with in the international terrorism context. And I was looking back when I was rereading your bio again, Matt, I noticed that you actually started your career in the Civil Rights Division. And in some of the cases, especially the hate crimes issues or the things that involve hate crimes or the white supremacist cases, these types of things, seems to me that this is an area where the National Security Division might be coordinating with the Civil Rights Division, perhaps in a way that it never has before. There's always been a close coordination between NSD and the Criminal Division, some coordination on certain issues with civil, but can you talk a little bit about how at a departmental level, this new threat and this new environment has created more opportunities for collaboration across the department?
Yeah, that's a terrific insight, Carrie, and really critically important. So yes, as you noted, I started my career at the Justice Department some years ago in the Civil Rights Division. Coming back to the department now in this job, one of my first meetings when I first started was with Kristen Clark, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, and the reason, lots of reasons to have that relationship, but first and foremost is the reality is that when we talk about domestic terrorism, some of the most significant, most heinous domestic terrorism attacks are also hate crimes. And we have charged those cases with the Civil Rights Division in the lead using our very effective hate crime statute. So if you think about Charleston or Pittsburgh or El Paso, all of those attacks were hate crimes and were prosecuted by the Civil Rights Division prosecutors in their criminal section. And we in the National Security Division were playing a supportive role. And in fact, with Buffalo, the attack in Buffalo, that is being, announced yesterday, in fact, by the Attorney General when he went to Buffalo, that is being charged as a hate crime and being handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Buffalo, along with the Civil Rights Division. So just to give you some sense, when that happened that weekend, I was in touch, and the National Security Division was immediately in touch with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Buffalo and with our counterparts in the Civil Rights Division, looking at, I think what I would think that your audience would hope and expect. We are one team. We are looking at this heinous attack. What can we do, immediately? How do we coordinate best? What is the right tool to use? We're also, of course, coordinating with state and local authorities because, of course, that was also a state crime and was charged as a state crime in New York. So there's often multiple moving pieces. Our fundamental commitment is that we are going to find the best tool and the best authority to hold perpetrators accountable and bring justice to the victims in these communities. And it is the case that when it comes to domestic terrorism, it is often going to be, particularly when we talk about racially motivated white supremacist violence, it's going to be a Civil Rights Division lead, a civil rights lead charging hate crimes with the National Security Division playing a supportive role. But even with Buffalo, that weekend, I was on a conference call with hundreds of stakeholders around the country, joining with Kristen Clark and the U.S. Attorney in Buffalo and the FBI to bring, give what information we could from our perspective. But it was really, the message is that we're one big team here in the Justice Department, and there are going to be tools that we have and authorities we have to bring to bear, and we're just going to figure out which is the right approach in each individual case.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the things as you were describing that, I was just noting some of the shooting events that you mentioned. So Charleston, Pittsburgh, El Paso, Buffalo, those all seem to be events that there was this lone individual who was the perpetrator of those. And so that is this big category of the events that the country is experiencing. Parallel to that, we do have what seems to be a growth and proliferation of groups. And so I want to pause for a minute and shift our conversation a little bit to some of the groups that we're seeing become more visible just across the country. And I worry a little bit that they're almost being mainstreamed somewhat into at least some sect of the political environment. So when we think about I guess my question is, how are you and DOJ thinking about the current crop of domestic violent groups? If we think about like Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, this group Patriot Front, which is the group that was pulled out of a U-Haul a few days ago in Idaho and arrested. In the national security community, I just have this sense that these groups are not taken as seriously as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the international terrorist groups that we worked for the last 20 years. So my question at a very specific level is, how does DOJ assess the organization, the communications capacity, the resourcing of these groups? Are they more like international terrorist organizations, or are they more like criminal gangs from where you sit?
I think the way I think about this question, and it's an important question, is a couple things. One, it's really important when we talk about the types of criminal activity that we are concerned about when it comes to domestic terrorism, hate crimes, the type of what we see from individuals who carry out attacks. Like, it's really important. A fundamental distinction is between violence and threats of violence that violate the criminal law, particularly federal law when it comes to the Department of Justice, on the one hand, and First Amendment protected activity, whether that's activity involving speech, activity involving association. It is not against the law to associate with other people who hold extremist or hateful views or abhorrent views. Right. The reality is that is First Amendment protected. It is core to our values as a country that people can hold these viewpoints. They can associate with other people who hold those viewpoints, and that's not against the law. And in fact, we cannot and we do not investigate people based on their views or their associations solely. So that's just a really important point, and it bears emphasis. What we are focused on is when these ideas, these viewpoints, or these associations manifest in some way in an act of violence or a threat of violence. And look, obviously, with you and this very sophisticated audience understand when I say that's easier said than done, right? That line can be hard to find. And hard to draw. Like, when is somebody who's on that path of espousing radical views, extremist views, abhorrent views that we all should be willing to call out, but that are not criminal and are not the basis for an investigation? When does somebody cross over that line? And when can we then open an investigation? Can the FBI predicate an investigation and start to use the tools it has to collect information about it, to collect evidence about that person? That's a tough challenge for the government. So I think when we talk about these groups, we aren't going to be investigating groups as groups. This is partly a lesson that we've learned over the course of our history, most sort of starkly in the Church Committee report in the 1970s, right, where there were abuses by the FBI and the intelligence community of tracking people based on their views or based on their associations. So we've learned that lesson. So how do we then apply that today, right? How do we know that there are individuals and groups who are on that path to becoming violent? We have to rely on our typical law enforcement collection sources, people in the neighborhood, families, others to provide information to us when they see that happening. That's a real challenge. And I can talk more about the nature of that challenge, but the other thing I guess I would say in response to your question about, are we taking them seriously? I mean, look, the way we show that we're taking something seriously is through our court filings and our charging documents, right? So with the Justice Department, when the way that we have taken a group of individuals seriously is when we've charged them with crimes. We've charged in the January 6th set of cases, we've charged a group of Proud Boys with seditious conspiracy, a very, very serious, rarely charged crime. We've charged a group of Oath Keepers with seditious conspiracy. very serious crime. So we've made our case in those filings of what our allegations are. We will seek to prove those allegations in court. That's how we will identify the criminal activity that we believe they engaged in, and that's how we will demonstrate the seriousness of purpose that we bring to bear when we see the violence that those groups engaged in.
That's a wonderful explanation of how the Justice Department is thinking of it, and it is very different than the international terrorism context. It's quite different, and brings in so many different aspects of criminal law enforcement to bear to be able to address the domestic threat. I appreciate your articulation of the thinking on the First Amendment. And on one hand, so I thought if we could just dive into that a little bit more. So on one hand, that clearly, I mean, you know, when I watch all the public testimony of national security leaders and FBI Director Wray talk about January 6th or talk about the domestic violence threat, clearly they're within the government, within the Justice Department or FBI, First Amendment is at the forefront of minds in terms of navigating these cases. And so I hear you when you say this is a huge challenge to be able to navigate that. I'm curious how the Justice Department is working with investigators and prosecutors to navigate that, because on one hand, we do have a First Amendment and we're going to respect that, and everybody in law enforcement is going to adhere to the law, and we want to have guidelines and rules, but we also want to have guidelines and rules that reflect where the boundaries actually are. The First Amendment's not a suicide pact. And so are you guys doing anything different in terms of training or policies that or updating the investigative guidelines or anything like that that can help investigators understand what they are and aren't allowed to do? Because some of the stuff that's come out publicly after January 6th, you just get this feeling a little bit that there was a lot of fear about crossing lines on the First Amendment when it comes to investigating from a prevention standpoint.
Yeah, so I think there is some, and I think it's appropriate, right? I know you're not suggesting otherwise, but I think it's appropriate that there's a lot of thought and care given to making sure that we stay on the right side of that line. And in fact, it's exactly in some ways why the National Security Division was created. We have, not only do we have the prosecutors in the counterterrorism section, but we have a large group of prosecutors in our law and policy group that are dedicated and have written papers and looked at these questions and helped provide training and guidance to the FBI to help them discern where is that line between protected First Amendment activity and threats of violence or violence upon which, under the FBI's own guidelines, they can begin to investigate. And as you know, and maybe folks in the audience know, there's sort of this tiering approach to the FBI and how it approaches its investigation, starting with the lowest level of techniques that they can use, the least intrusive techniques based on a minimal amount of predication that moves up the scale to being able to, at the highest level based on probable cause, request search warrants or wiretaps, right? The most intrusive techniques. And it's a very well-established approach. Can it be improved? Absolutely. We're always trying to learn to make it better, to your question, and to be responsive to the nature of the threat as it changes and morphs. But the basic structure is sound. The basic structure of the more predication, the more evidence you have of criminal activity, the more intrusive techniques you can use. I just think, going back to what I said before in our conversation before about the difference between groups, domestic groups and international terrorist organizations, there's just a whole different set of techniques and authorities that apply in the international terrorism context. As well as anybody around, how FISA works, right? Where you can obtain authority to wiretap, to conduct electronic surveillance based on someone's status as an agent of a foreign power. That is different from the domestic context, where we don't collect intelligence against agents of a domestic power, right? There's no such thing, and there's no appetite for that, and that would be contrary, I think, to our basic values. What we do focus on is our law enforcement techniques, which are tried and true, whether we talk about, I was a prosecutor for 12 years here in Washington, and I did organized crime cases and gang cases where we did wiretaps and search warrants. We had sources into those groups. We had a lot of techniques to collect information and evidence against those groups. True when it comes to the mafia or all kinds of public corruption cases. So these are techniques that are tried and true, that work and are effective against individuals and individuals who banded together for the purpose of committing acts of violence. And so I'm very confident in the strength of those tools and those approaches. But look, I will validate your your concern. Are we making sure that we're aggressive enough? And I think that's a role that, as lawyers, it's a role I've played, you've played in the past. How do you give the operators, whether we're talking about FBI agents, NSA operators, CIA officers, within sort of this broad set of people who are involved in national security work, how do you give them, as lawyers, how do you give them an understanding of where that line is, how they can comfortably and confidently use the authorities that Congress and the American people have given us, while also making sure that we are staying on the right side of that line. It's why this work is so fascinating, to be honest, and why it's so challenging. But I think it's incumbent on us as national security lawyers and as leaders to provide that level of guidance and confidence to the people who are on the front lines in protecting the country.
Right. And this, just to provide a little bit of context for our viewers, this goes to the prevention piece, right? So the investigative piece, criminal authorities can be used to help disrupt a potential act of violence or potential act of domestic terrorism. And so on that prevention piece, it is interesting though, Matt, to hear you talk about the intelligence side of it. Obviously, NSD plays sort of a unique role in the Justice Department in that you are the sort of connective tissue to the intelligence community, and you had your former hat as the National Counterterrorism Director. There is, particularly in the after reviews of January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol, there is a little bit of in the public dialogue, a remaining question about what the role of intelligence should have been. And so I guess my question is the US government doesn't collect using the same authorities against these domestic groups the same way that it does against international terrorism groups, but there is some intelligence collection that could be in information obtained from state and locals, information that's obtained from complainants. There is an intelligence role. So can you talk a little bit about how whether it's intelligence coming from the FBI or from state and locals or coming from DHS, intelligence and analysis. Can you talk a little bit though about how the intelligence and warning system should work in the domestic terrorism context?
Yeah, that's a great point. And ideally, you hit on it, ideally, you have this community of FBI, at the federal level, FBI and DHS in particular, and at the state and local level, you have multiple times more first responders and police and firefighters who are often going to be the first set of law enforcement to be confronted with somebody who's is moving toward violence, and then you have the even broader ecosystem of teachers, religious leaders, social workers, sort of community-oriented folks who are also going to be in a position. So, ideally, you want all that information to flow in a sort of a trusted environment. The other key piece is social media. Also, a lot of this information is publicly available, right? What we see in terms of people's talking about moving toward violence or actually involved in inciting violence. A lot of that's taking place out in the open in social media, on social media channels. So the challenge is it's a lot of information. How do you focus it? What are the authorities to see and obtain that information? some of those authorities are lodged within the Department of Homeland Security, and our friend Ken Wainstein was just confirmed last week as the head of intelligence and analysis, and this is going to be front and center in terms of, for him, I think, and along with, the FBI field offices, and a key construct there, as folks may know, is the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, which were stood up post 9/11, but these task forces include federal officers as well as state and local officers, and the goal being, right, to meld together that ecosystem in one field office, task force, to make sure that information flows and is investigated appropriately.
Let me ask you a follow-up.
Yeah,
we got a question from the audience that's on the topic of social media, which you mentioned a moment ago. So the question was, what role should the DOJ, or I'll ask you, what role does DOJ play in collaboration or coordination or in dialogue with private technology and information companies to curb the rise of domestic terrorism? Can you talk a little bit about those partnership and those dialogues that take place?
Yeah, so there's a couple levels at which that relationship takes place. One is informal. Are there relationships established for companies, whether social media companies or other types of companies, to provide information to the government when they see something that concerns them in terms of violating their own terms of service or otherwise is alarming? Certainly, you see that in the context of child exploitation, right? That's a well-established relationship between the government and companies that are social media platforms. But that also spills over into other forms of public safety, including domestic terrorism or potential violence. So that's one level, those sort of relationships that are really important. The other, though, and I'll speak to this with some degree of firsthand knowledge. Before I came back to government, I spent 3 years at Uber as the chief trust and security officer at Uber. And one of the teams that I oversaw was the law enforcement response team. And as you would expect, Uber, like a lot of companies in the technology space, has a lot of data that could be of interest to law enforcement. So we had strong working relationships at the federal level, but also with state and local police departments who were often issuing subpoenas, in some cases search warrants, depending on our rules, to obtain information. So there's the point being, beyond the relationship, collaboration, there's the standard compulsory process, which is a way for the government, the federal government, the Department of Justice in particular plays a role there, right, through federal prosecutors and the FBI in issuing process to, whether we're talking about telecommunications companies or social media platforms or rideshare companies, right? The whole range of companies that could have information that could break a case open because you have been able to collect that key piece of data. And look, I'll say this from my own experience, it was really important for us in my private sector world to have those strong relationships with the police and departments around the country, really around the world, where there's rule of law regimes in place. So it's a big challenge to the question. It's not like, I'm not trying to give it short shrift, because it's a very the terrain is really complicated, and there's different levels of cooperation by different companies, for sure, and that's part of the challenge too. But it is a key part of the solution as we try to understand the nature of the threat.
In our remaining time, this has been great, Matt. Thank you for all of your insights. In our remaining few minutes here, let's turn to authorities. And you mentioned early on in the conversation, we've seen the use of seditious conspiracy used in the January 6th cases, which to my mind, I think it right after the attack on the Capitol, that was the first statute that I was looking back at, thinking about how that would potentially be used. And so now, as the Justice Department has continued its extensive investigations, we see those seditious conspiracy charges coming out. We've talked about the hate crimes laws that are available. And so the Justice Department really has demonstrated that it has taken a fresh look at all the different authorities that potentially are available to prosecute these types of cases. And then one would presume investigate. That provides the basis to be able to investigate in a proactive way. My question is on domestic terrorism, do you have the authorities you need to do your job?
Yeah, so the answer is yes. We basically have the authorities we need. I think we've sort of shown that with how we've responded to the threats over the past several years. We have the criminal statutes in terms of substantive criminal law, seditious conspiracy, obstruction, the hate crime statutes. Those federal laws in combination with state laws provide, from a substantive criminal law perspective, the range of authorities I think that are sufficient to meet the task. There are some areas where we've looked at potentially tweaking some of those statutes and we've had some internal conversations about proposals along those lines. But generally speaking, on the substantive criminal law, we're in good shape. And I think similarly on the process side, the ability to get search warrants, the ability to issue process, to compel the provision of data. We also have pretty well established, tried and true methods of getting the information we need. So I think we're in okay shape. I do. I will say this. There's the nature of the threat is particularly challenging, and I think this is this is responsive to your question about authorities. And the reason I say it's particularly challenging is what we are talking about are individuals alone, sometimes, like I said, individuals acting alone or in very small cells who meet secretly, covertly. They don't communicate using open channels. They're often using encryption. So our opportunity to see what they're doing and understand what they're doing before they act is limited. You're
going to give me an opportunity here at the end, Matt, to ask if we are living going dark.
Right. So there's the encryption problem. And there is also the problem of they choose soft targets, as we've seen, schools, shopping malls, shopping centers, places of worship. We cannot defend those places, nor do we want to create, I think, as a country, hardened locations where we all meet, in our lives. And then third, and importantly, is the ease of access to military-grade weapons. Right. And as long as you have people who can communicate secretly, who pick soft targets, who have access to high-powered weapons, we are going to have attacks that often inflict harm on a mass scale. And that is a challenge, just the reality of the challenge that we face in law enforcement today.
Well, I'm going to thank you for that last point. I heard you when you said it with our friends at George Washington's Program on Extremism yesterday at their symposium. I'm really glad that you are concluding our conversation with that point, because in the national security community, we don't often hear our national security leaders talk about the availability of weapons of war as something that is a threat to Americans and a threat to law enforcement. The proliferation Correct. Of these weapons, in my view, makes law enforcement's job so much harder, so much more dangerous. And so I'm just really grateful for you in your leadership role that you are so open and clear about that point.
Great. No, it's an absolutely, I think, indisputable fact. So yeah, and you're right. It does create harm or risk to not just the community, but to law enforcement as well.
Right. Well, listen, Matt Olson, Assistant Attorney General for National Security, friend of CNAS and longtime friend, thank you for joining me for this Safe at Home conversation. We're so grateful for your knowledge, for your experience, and for your continued willingness and enthusiasm about serving in public service. So thanks, Matt, and we'll be in touch soon. Thanks for joining us. And for all of you, thank you for joining our conference edition of Safe at Home. And we appreciate you sticking with us for future sessions for the rest of the day.
Thank you.
The People's Bank of China, China's central bank, is developing the digital yuan, the first digital version of a fiat currency from a major economy. The digital yuan will likely strengthen the Chinese Communist Party's domestic digital authoritarianism. As countries look for models to manage central bank money, Beijing's digital yuan will bring about new standards in the global financial system that risk privacy and governance principles. So far, we know that the digital yuan system will have a two-tier structure, with the central bank managing the back end and state banks and private companies facilitating everyday transactions. It will not be blockchain-based. The most groundbreaking and alarming feature of the digital yuan is controllable anonymity, which allows China's central bank to see nearly all real-time transactions. China's central bank wants to harness the market share and technological innovation of private firms and gain direct access to Chinese consumers' financial data. It aims to shape monetary policy, monitor illegal activity, and curb corruption. The Chinese Communist Party will likely leverage the system to surveil Chinese citizens. The digital yuan system would make it easier for the party to cut off financial access of any individual. Pilot tests have been underway since mid-2020. If successful, China may gain an edge over the United States in financial technology innovation. China will make the digital yuan available for wider use during the Beijing Winter Olympics in February 2022. U.S. policymakers must address the digital yuan's potential to further Beijing's coercive power and influence in the global financial system. America must adapt to the evolving payments space, counter the digital yuan's threats to political and economic liberty, and ensure that innovation in financial technology does not advance China's digital authoritarianism. The United States faces a challenge like no other in its history, a strategic competition with a rising China. Technology is at the center of this competition. Leaders who can harness technology for economic, political, and military power will have an outsized influence on shaping our world. America needs a national technology strategy to drive innovation, mitigate risk, and compete for security and prosperity. But America cannot compete alone. The U.S. approach to technology must involve partnering with like-minded countries. America benefits from a network of allies and partners, including the world's top technology and economic leaders, and it must capitalize on this advantage. A technology alliance is the best way for tech-leading democracies to work together on big issues such as groundbreaking research and development, securing supply chains, and defending technology norms rooted in democratic values. The core group should include the world's tech-leading democracies. These countries should engage on technologies such as artificial intelligence, 5G telecommunications, semiconductors, and energy storage. And they should engage on issues including standard setting, export controls, and investment reviews. To do this well, stakeholders from industry and civil society should have a seat at the table. If tech-leading democracies fail to work together, they're unlikely to win the global competition. At stake is the ability to shape a democratic technological future. Collaborating with partners and allies matters, because the countries that adopt new technologies and shape their use will write the future rules of the road. A technology alliance of democratic countries will empower citizens, compete economically, and help states protect their security, all without having to compromise shared values or national sovereignty. Tech-leading democracies need to form an alliance to ensure that the future of innovation is inclusive, prosperous, and secure.
The United States is set for a prolonged period of competition with Russia, but especially China. The two countries are increasingly aligned, especially in their desire to counter the United States, and that will create challenges that the United States is going to have to navigate.
The Russia-China partnership is most problematic in the areas in which it amplifies the challenge that China poses to the United States, particularly in two domains, democracy and human rights, and in the defense realm. China and Russia are aligned in weakening and interfering in democracies around the world, and they're also bolstering autocrats, providing them the training and the technology to better muzzle their own citizens. At the same time, at the international level, they are weakening human rights protections and also proposing new norms in emerging areas such as internet sovereignty and cyber.
In the defense domain, Russia is amplifying China's military capabilities, basically making it easier for China to keep the United States out of its backyard. And in the technology domain, too, the two countries are increasingly working together, raising the risk that Russia and China together can out-innovate the United States, which would strain an already stressed U.S. defense budget. Some people have talked about driving a wedge between Russia and China, but that's unlikely to be effective. Instead, over the longer term, Washington needs to think about how it can change Russia's calculus such that it views some cooperation with the United States not just as possible, but also preferable to its growing subservience to Beijing.
So the United States needs to respond to the China-Russia partnership in a few key ways. The first is by monitoring and preparing for the relationship. This includes better intelligence sharing, wargaming, and we also need to be taking advantage of the fissures that exists between China and Russia going forward. At the same time, we need to be creating headwinds against the China-Russia entente, and that includes working with our allies and partners, bolstering our democracy and bolstering the resilience of democracies around the world.
The increasing cooperation between Russia and China is a challenge, but it's not an insurmountable one. I think as long as the United States is mindful and proactive and leverages its assets, things like allies and partners, that it's a challenge that the United States is well equipped to overcome.
The United States faces a challenge like no other in its history, a strategic competition with a rising China. Technology is at the center of this competition. Leaders who can harness technology for economic, political, and military power will have an outsized influence on shaping our world. America needs a national technology strategy to drive innovation, mitigate risk, and compete for security and prosperity. But America cannot compete alone. The U.S. approach to technology must involve partnering with like-minded countries. America benefits from a network of allies and partners, including the world's top technology and economic leaders, and it must capitalize on this advantage. A technology alliance is the best way for tech-leading democracies to work together on big issues such as groundbreaking research and development, securing supply chains, and defending technology norms rooted in democratic values. The core group should include the world's tech-leading democracies. These countries should engage on technologies such as artificial intelligence, 5G telecommunications, semiconductors, and energy storage. And they should engage on issues including standard setting, export controls, and investment reviews. To do this well, stakeholders from industry and civil society should have a seat at the table. If tech-leading democracies fail to work together, they're unlikely to win the global competition. At stake is the ability to shape a democratic technological future. Collaborating with partners and allies matters because the countries that adopt new technologies and shape their use will write the future rules of the road. A technology alliance of democratic countries will empower citizens, compete economically, and help states protect their security, all without having to compromise shared values or national sovereignty. Tech-leading democracies need to form an alliance to ensure that the future of innovation is inclusive, prosperous, and secure.
Good morning. On behalf of the Center for a New American Security, welcome to today's event, The Future of Coercive Economic Statecraft After Russia. My name is Emily Kilcrease. I'm the Director and Senior Fellow here at CNAS in the Energy Economics and Security Program. The Energy Economics and Security Program explores dynamics of the global economy and its implications for U.S. national security, foreign policy, and economic statecraft. Today's event brings together an expert panel to discuss the evolving world of U.S. economic statecraft in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The measures imposed against Russia by the United States and its allies represent a remarkable evolution in the use of sanctions and export controls. The sanctioning economies have shown a level of coordination and resolve previously unheard of for such a large economy and one so integrated in the global economy. They've done so at a scale and speed unlike ever before. Amongst other measures, the United States and its allies have been willing to target the largest Russian financial institutions with sanctions and have also blocked the Russian central bank's access to its assets abroad. The United States and its allies have also leveraged their control of advanced technologies, strategic technologies, to prohibit the export of such technology to Russia, aiming to significantly degrade Russia's military capabilities and its ability to produce energy and project power over the long term. This marks a generational change in how export controls are now being used as a sanctioning instrument. And the list of measures goes on and on. Of particular note, the United States, Europe, and key Asian allies worked closely together for months to prepare for the possibility of an invasion, coordinating closely to develop sanctions packages. This allowed them to quickly roll out a coordinated set of measures within hours of the invasion, and then allowed them to be ready to impose a series of escalatory steps in quick succession. Central bank sanctions, one of the most severe measures a sanctioning state can take, were agreed over that first long weekend of the invasion, a remarkably quick response. As the war has now surpassed the 100-day mark, we're taking the opportunity to bring together a truly expert panel of sanctions and economic practitioners to take stock of where we are now, assess how the situation will evolve in Russia, and think more strategically about the future. How will we use coercive economic statecraft with the lessons learned from the Russia context? Lessons learned by the United States, by its allies, and by its adversaries. We're also using today's event to announce the release of a special edition of the CNAS Sanctions by the Numbers report focused on Russia. In this major report, we break down the thousands of sanctioning actions taken so far, examine how the sanctions have or have not impacted Russian decision-making, and offer our analysis for why Russia is likely to remain a heavily sanctioned jurisdiction for the foreseeable future, even if there is an end to the fighting. You can find the report on our website at cnas.org. Now let me introduce our panel for today. I'd like to welcome Dr. Erica Moret. Erica is an expert on sanctions and humanitarian affairs, and amongst many of her positions, she is a senior researcher at the Global Governance Center and the Center for Humanitarian Studies, and she coordinates the Geneva International Sanctions Network. Alina Rybakova, an adjunct senior fellow here at CNAS, who also directs the IIF's economic research on emerging markets with special interest in Russian economics and financial stability. Rachel Ziemba, an adjunct senior fellow here at CNAS. She serves as a strategic advisor at Alpha Z Advisors and is the founder of Ziemba Insights, a macroeconomic research firm. And last but not least, Eddie Fishman, adjunct senior fellow at CNAS and previously a sanctions policy official at the State Department, including in 2014 after the prior invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So thank you to our excellent panelists for being here today. I'm looking forward to this discussion. We'll proceed today along two major themes. The first is to take stock of where we are with Russia today. It's an important foundation for the conversation that we'll move to next, which is how does coercive economic statecraft look after Russia? But first, let's talk about where we are now with the Russia sanctions, which have been more complicated, more complex, and at larger scale than I think anyone anticipated. We'll take audience questions throughout this panel, so please go to the conference website or look for us on Twitter to feed in questions for the panel to respond to, and we'll sprinkle those in as we go. So first, let's talk about Russia and where we are today with the sanctions. And I'll go first to Eddie. Eddie, you were involved in putting in place the original sanctions against Russia for its annexation of Crimea and involvement in eastern Ukraine in 2014. Our response now reflects lessons learned by the United States. What do you think has changed in terms of how we've responded? What lessons have we learned as a bureaucracy, as a sanctioning economy? And similarly, how has Russia taken lessons away? This is an iterated game with both players learning lessons and responding and trying to anticipate each other's actions. How do you think both sides are playing this game right now, starting with the United States?
Thanks so much, Emily. I'm really excited for today's discussion. I can't imagine a better panel. So I think the biggest lesson that we took away from 2014 is that preparation is absolutely essential, specifically when you're sanctioning a large integrated economy like Russia. You can't just shoot from the hip when you're worried about unintended macroeconomic effects. It's not like sanctioning North Korea or Cuba, a country where you're not really worried about, affecting global commodities markets or the global financial system. And I think a critical difference between 2014 and 2022 is back then, the Crimea annexation took us by surprise. So by the time, the Duma had annexed Crimea, we didn't have a Russia sanctions team at the State Department. We didn't have a menu of sanctions options that we had vetted that was ready to go. And what this meant was that we were trying to build the plane as it was in the air. And unfortunately, it really slowed us down. And if you just look at the timeline back then, the annexation of Crimea happened in March, and we didn't actually impose sectoral sanctions until July. So there was a 4-month gap. And I do think that the Biden administration learned that lesson. And as soon as they had that early warning of the invasion, in the third and fourth quarter of 2021, they really did start vetting options internally, working with the G7 and the European Commission to coordinate those options. And as a result, as you mentioned, we had a sanctions menu ready to go. Of course, we didn't know exactly what we would do because some of that depended on what Russia would do and what political appetites would bear. But we had this menu. And I also think there was some luck involved in that people like Dalip Singh and Peter Harrell, two members, core members of our team in 2014, were in a position to be influential again this time. So people who had been in the trenches with us sort of in the days of 2014 were kind of back at it. I think another lesson, a really important lesson from 2014 is that I think we have much greater latitude to use serious economic measures against Russia than we really initially thought. In 2014, we were very nervous about targeting large Russian state-owned enterprises. We were focused specifically on the very long term of the Russian economy. So in the energy sector, for instance, we focused on next generation oil extraction technologies relevant to Arctic offshore deepwater and shale. We only really imposed debt restrictions on the large SOEs. And I think what we realized in that experience is that we actually did have latitude to go quite a bit further. And I think some of that confidence is what enabled the West to move quickly to measures like full blocking sanctions on VTB and SWIFT bans on large Russian banks, and of course, the sanctions action against the Central Bank of Russia. I think the third lesson, and this one is probably a little bit more complex, and I think it's one that we hopefully can explore today, and if not, in the months and years ahead, is that deterrence is a more viable objective for sanctions than compellence. And what I mean by that is in 2014, we actually had good evidence that the threat of new sanctions did have an impact on Russian decision-making. And it did, rein in Putin's objectives for the Novorossiya project and at least played some contributing factor in leading to the Minsk agreements. And of course, we also saw that compellence is really hard. There was very, very little, I think, optimism within the administration in 2014 and the years thereafter that we could actually use sanctions to force Russia out of Crimea or out of the Donbass. So, and I think Biden took this lesson to heart and really tried to use sanctions as a deterrent, right? If you go back to January and February, we had some of the clearest and most high-level presidential statements I've ever heard, right, about swift and severe sanctions consequences, sanctions unlike anything we've ever seen on Russia. And they did follow through on that, but unfortunately deterrence failed, right? And Putin did launch the invasion despite all of these threats. And I think one thing we'll have to unpack in the months and years to come is why it failed. And I don't think it's enough just to say that Russia could never be deterred by sanctions, because to pivot to the second part of your question, which is Russian preparation, Putin did a lot in the last 8 years, and not just Putin, but Russian technocrats, in the central bank and the finance ministry to prepare for sanctions. This was a high priority. And, they built up this war chest of $630+ billion. And yet they left 2/3 of those assets exposed to sanctions, denominated in euros, dollars, pounds, and yen. And so what that tells me is that Putin actually didn't expect, he miscalculated. He did not expect the West to go as far as we did. And so I think that gives us a clue potentially as why, at least one potential explanation as to why deterrence failed. So I don't think Fortress Russia played out the way that Putin expected, and that the central bank reserves have not been as helpful as they anticipated because the sanctions went further. But some of the other sort of infrastructural moves that Russia took, I do think have helped. Specifically, creating the Mir payments system and really requiring the domestic credit card payments infrastructure to switch onto Mir and to domicile that technology within Russia, I think has allowed Russian consumer payments to continue even with Visa and MasterCard leaving the country. And I think that would have been completely catastrophic, of course, to Russians if they could no longer make credit card payments, and that has not been the case. And then, of course, SPFS, the domestic payments messaging network alternative to SWIFT, I think has helped shield or at least lessen the blow of the SWIFT bans on banks like VTB and Sberbank. So I think some of Russia's preparation helped and some did not.
Alina, I'd like to bring you in to respond to this as well, particularly keeping in mind how Russia and Russian technocrats have been able to blunt the damage of some of the sanctions. When the sanction packages, the early packages were initially imposed, it seemed like a bit of scrambling, a bit of shock and awe, but then the situation stabilized. Russia's obviously still getting a massive amount of export revenue from the energy sector. And so in some respects, on the economic domain, we are in a bit of a stalemate now. So walk us through how you're viewing, how well is Russia's economy doing now? It's contracting, but is it stable? How should we be measuring kind of the impact of sanctions moving forward from the Russian perspective?
Thank you, and I think Eddie did a fantastic sort of stage setting for our conversation. So let's dive into the details. Since 2014, Russian central bank and the technocrats have done a lot of preparation potentially for this moment. And one of them was accumulating reserves abroad, which was, of course, didn't play out as well as they were hoped for, and they were not expecting the degree of sanctions. But at the same time, they also introduced inflation targeting. They cleaned up the banking system, where there were used to be more than 1,000 banks in Russia. Now there's a little bit over 400. So, and also tightened banking supervision. They strengthened their liquidity provision instruments, so they can do liquidity provision in foreign currency as well as in local currency. And they also implement the fiscal rule, where the big chunk of revenues, basically all revenues over about $40 per barrel, go to the special reserve fund. So I think all of that helped to prepare the economy for classical balance of payments shocks, which they learned from 2014. Sanctions can be like a balance of payment shock, but just sort of a bit more complex and harder to analyze, but nonetheless it is a sort of a balance of payment shock. So I think that sort of sets the stage for central bank's response. The central bank responded very professionally. We know in the early days they were trying to intervene. As soon as on the weekend, following the weekend, they learned that the reserves will be frozen. They stopped that. They doubled the rate from 9.5 to 20. They put in draconian capital controls, and that is one on the export side, which is 80% of the export proceeds had to be surrendered to the market within 3 days. And then on the outflow side, they prevented foreign investors from leaving the market, and they also froze domestic foreign currency deposits and prevented individuals converting into foreign currency. So these were all extreme measures. And to be honest, if you remember Yugoslavia, Milosevic, it was he was remembered for freezing individuals' foreign currency deposits. So it was not an easy step to take, even for an authoritarian regime. But as a result of these measures, the financial system has indeed stabilized, although there were severe bank runs in the early days, and we know that from the data. The banking system liquidities used to be in a large surplus vis-a-vis the central bank, more than 2 trillion rubles. It went to a large deficit, and now it seems to have come back. But I would like to separate, and as you say, it's a multi-stage game in this sort of horrendous game of chess, and Russia has played this part well. But I would like to separate financial sector from the real economy. And even though the financial sector appears to have stabilized, the real economy is only beginning to feel the pain. Russian companies have 3 to 6 months of inventories, and usually in crisis they draw down those inventories. But now it's a different kind of crisis. They spent 30 years integrating into the fabric of global trade, and not just about commodities, but about everything else, because they import a large part of almost anything else that they consume domestically, whether it's machinery, equipment, know-how, sort of industrial production, or even consumer goods. So they need now to rip apart those 30 years of fabric that ties Russian economy to the global economy. And domestic industrials have done a survey. More than 86% of companies have felt the sanctions already. Russian central bank also did a cross-regional survey of 13,000 enterprises. Almost every single one of them is exposed. And if you look at industry by industry, I think each one of them is looking for new components, new suppliers for chemicals. So we're expecting the economy to decelerate substantially in the coming months as the companies have to retool. And I think here your expertise, on export controls have played a very important role, and also self-sanctioning by companies, because they decided that for compliance reasons, uncertainty reasons, ethical reasons, Russia has become too toxic to work with.
Thank you. And I do want to come back to that concept of self-sanctioning later in the conversation. But for now, let's turn to Erica. I wanted to get your thoughts on the unity within Europe as part of the sanctioning coalition. Clearly, one of the more impactful features of everything that's happened on the economic domain has been the fact that there has been this massive coordination amongst economies, but particularly within Europe. But as the war continues, as there are broader economic ripple effects, as energy prices go up and Europe has to take harder steps to wean itself off of Russian independence, as food prices continue to rise, as the refugee situation continues to worsen, which will have a harder impact on Europe. How do you see those factors impacting this unified coalition? We've already started to see some friction there, but do you see the coalition holding? What will European leaders need to do in order to maintain that unity of purpose?
I think you're right that the unity that has been achieved within the European Union and more widely as well with other allies is really impressive. And we saw this, of course, in the first round of sanctions from 2014, where many questioned the possibility that unity could be held among the then 28, now 27 member states of the EU. And of course, this is really the first time that a country of such importance, a G20 member, major energy supplier, has been sanctioned to this degree, particularly given the very heavy dependence on energy supplies and other industrial relations between various European countries and the EU. So I think it's on one level, it's very impressive that this unity has been forged and maintained. And I think it's not at all surprising that there are these tensions, because when we look at different European countries, we see very different types of relationships with Russia, be it close economic relations, energy dependence, former cultural ties, religious orthodoxy ties, and so on. So the interests, the motivations of different European member states and European nations more widely varies. And in spite of this, I think the fact that unity has been achieved really demonstrates the seriousness of the situation and how much it's seen as a threat to wider European security and sovereignty. On top of this, I think the fact that there's quite serious risks of retaliation that are also relatively unprecedented also marks the quite unprecedented nature of this type of unity. Of course, there are risks of countermeasures that we're already seeing in terms of halts to gas supplies, agricultural controls that we've seen Russia implementing for many years now. They're not termed sanctions necessarily, but countermeasures of different kinds. The use of disinformation has been extremely active, particularly in trying to weaken resolve and unity within Europe, and ability to carry out retaliatory acts such as cyber attacks. We've seen the use of chemical weapons on European soil in recent years, and then, of course, the veiled nuclear threats. And aside from this is also, of course, the diplomatic fallout that we see in other areas across the world where Russian collaboration on various protracted conflicts would be seen as vital. The final point on this, I think, is that unity was, as I said already, impressive in some of the earlier rounds of sanctions that we saw. And in a couple of studies that I worked on with a multidisciplinary team here at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, the results actually surprised us. And what we found is that the European countries that were most opposed to the renewal of the sanctions, and at that time it was the likes of Italy, Hungary, Cyprus, and so on, were actually some of the countries that were losing out the least in terms of losses of trade and other commercial ties. And those countries that were most supportive of the sanctions, particularly Baltic states, Poland, other neighbors to Russia, were the ones that lost out most economically, but were the most supportive. So I think it doesn't necessarily always equate in terms of economic costs and political support.
Thank you, Erica. Rachel, I want to turn to you to talk about kind of the last large sanctions target that's out there, which is the energy sector. I mean, from the beginning of the conflict, even dating back to the controversial debates about Nord Stream 2 in the United States, that has been a sore point because it is one of the last remaining targets where we can really inflict any sort of economic damage on Russia. There clearly have been steps to move in that direction, starting with the United States, followed more recently by some limited steps by the EU. How do you see that piece of the puzzle coming into place? And what are we watching for in terms of the larger global dynamics? You know, every car driver in the United States is probably watching their price at the pump go up. So what are you looking for in the energy sector moving forward?
Thanks, Emily. No, you're right. I mean, I think from the get-go, among those sort of policies being pre-gamed and considered by the administration and allies was this notion that Russia was such a large energy player, and that it wasn't a story of a smaller producer where one could really think realistically about cutting off current supplies, right? And so there's been this gradual evolution, as you say, starting with measures that were created to kind of impact longer term dynamics, export controls, as you and others have already mentioned, but also financing restrictions, some of which came into place over the last several years. Some of those long-term measures are actually having some short-term impacts. Noting sort of even this week, we've seen reductions in natural gas flows to Europe because of turbines being delayed and being delivered. There's some question mark about that. But ultimately, I think what we saw was sort of partial measures and this sort of recognition and balancing act of wanting to restrict Russia, constrain Russia, but also not send the world into a global recession. Now, of course, we might be headed to a global recession for a variety of reasons, including the war. But the goal has always been to try to calibrate here. And this is something where I think there will be lessons learned about how do you deal with large, sort of large players and the like. You asked in part, can this be effective? Throughout this conversation, I think we come back to what do we mean by effective and what the goals are. We'll probably come back to that later. If the answer is cutting off revenues, probably, partially, making it more difficult for Russia to shore up and maintain its military industrial base. There's some evidence of that. But one real question that's still out there is how to distribute the costs from the energy sanctions and restrictions. And that's been an issue from sort of early March onward, I would say, maybe even earlier. This question of, first of all, would G7 countries cut? It was very easy for Canada to cut because basically there was no Russian oil imports. But Europe, Japan, these are more difficult sort of measures, and also how to crowd in emerging markets. Now, right now, as you said about U.S. and global gas purchasers, the balance of risks there might be towards measures that try to restrict Russian revenues, but not necessarily its volume. Now, that requires, to some extent, a lot of countries to play ball, including Russia, right? Russia can make choices about how much, how to transmit those costs. The other thing, though, that I think is important here is to, when we think about energy sanctions and Russian revenues more generally, is what can they do with those revenues? Now, in the first couple of months of the economic sanctions, our sanctions actually meant that our choices meant that Russia couldn't spend very much, right? We have export controls. Russia's own policy measures made it harder to import. A lot of counterparties just said, well, we don't know if Russia can pay us, so why should we send them any goods? We don't know the rules. And so we saw very sharp drop-offs in exports from even countries like China to Russia. So even though they were building up new revenues, even though they couldn't access the previous ones, they couldn't spend them. Now, going forward, that's, I think, one of the things to watch, and it'll be a real issue for enforcement and otherwise. Will Chinese companies find pathways to send these goods? Will Chinese companies try to violate export controls? And what will the enforcement challenge of that be? The U.S. spent a lot of time building a broad coalition, especially in Asia, in a unique way, but that's something going forward. So it's not only this question mark of how much money they're earning, but can they use it? And in what ways can they use it? And that's where I think these metrics that Alina, for example, pointed to, and Eddie, of the sort of somewhat stabilization domestically become really important. And also watching whether alternate financing channels, say in India, whether those can work in an environment of increasingly restrictive banking channels.
Thank you. Now, with that scene set, I want to move us to the second part of our conversation, which is how do we take these lessons learned from Russia and think about what this means for the use of sanctions, export controls, other forms of coercive economic statecraft moving forward. As a reminder for our listeners, we will be taking audience questions throughout, so please go ahead and go to the conference website or Twitter to start feeding those in, and we'll get to them as we go. One of the first themes I want us to dig into is this question of smart sanctions, and whether smart sanctions is still something the United States and allies are pursuing. There was this concept that if you target the sanction precisely, if you do carve-outs to avoid unintended consequences, that you can use this tool without collateral damage, that you can control the impact of this policy tool. Obviously, what we've learned in the Russia context is that that is difficult, particularly at the scale that we are talking about. But what does this mean for other contexts? Are we done with the idea of smart sanctions? And Eddie, I'll go to you first for a response.
Sure. Yeah, I guess what I would say is, when I think of smart sanctions, I think about the specificity of targets, right? It's less about objectives. It's, are you being smart about imposing sanctions on an adversary such that they harm the adversary more than they harm ourselves? And as I see it, I actually think the West has done a pretty good job here in that, of course, there have been significant spillover effects. And I think that's something that was inevitable, right? When you're talking about broad-based sanctions like we're imposing upon Russia. But I do think that, the consequences could have been, the unintended consequences could have been much more severe. So I don't think that the concept is out the window. I think that what is important, though, if there's a lesson from this, it's that vetting that is done in terms of really trying to understand some of these codependencies and the potential externalities of sanctions is really important, and will be even more important moving forward if we're even going to consider using economic statecraft tools against large economies like China, for instance, in the future. And I hope we can talk about that later. I think another critique, at least I've heard of these Russia sanctions, is that they're not smart because they're not trying to achieve a specific policy goal, right? Or they're not trying to change Putin's calculus in some way. I think as policymakers, we do like to talk about sanctions as a two-way street, right? They're put on, and then if the target changes its behavior in a certain way, then they're taken off, right? But I actually think that attrition, using sanctions not for a psychological impact, but for a material goal, right? In this case, to curtail Russia's ability to launch similar military adventures and in the future, is in some ways almost a more pragmatic goal of sanctions than the more psychological effects, whether it's compellence or deterrence. So I actually think that, when you hear people like Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin say that, one of our goals is to weaken Russia, I think he took a lot of flack from that. But I actually think it's good for rhetoric to match reality, and it's also good for us to set a reasonable bar for success, right? I think if we set an impossibly high bar for success, if we say that the goal of sanctions is to stop the war and push Russia out of Ukraine forever, I think that you're sort of doomed to failure, and the risk you run then is that the will to impose sanctions over the long haul could erode. So I think I have a bit of a contrarian opinion here in the sanctions community, where I think that potentially reining in our objectives and thinking about this as a material goal, a goal of attrition against Russia, is actually smarter, frankly, than setting a bar for success that you'll never be able to meet.
Erica, I'd like to get your response on this as well. In your research, you've done a lot of work looking at de-risking, overcompliance, the impact that heavy sanctions regimes can have across jurisdictions. So looking beyond just the Russia context, what do you make of this conversation around smart sanctions and how we should think about our ability to control the impact of the sanctions tool moving forward?
I would say if we look at the development of sanctions use globally over the last 20 years, we've moved from the development of targeted or smart sanctions at that crisis point we saw in around the year 2000 in response to Iraq, Cuba, Yugoslavia, Haiti, etc. And in spite of that, I would say particularly over the last decade, what we've seen is in many cases a kind of almost a return to embargoes or de facto comprehensive sanctions regimes in a way. And there's a number of reasons for this. One is that we're seeing not only the US, but also the EU and now a number of other actors as well, the UK, Canada, etc., starting to adopt much broader sectoral sanctions, including those that impact on strategically important industries, energy, finance, and so on. And what we've seen elsewhere in a number of studies and a number of case studies is that sanctions geared towards central banks, for example, immediately start to have an impact on the ordinary people, on the general population. We also have a rising complexity of sanctions regimes where in many cases, including the case of Russia, we have a multi-layering of different autonomous sanctions regimes. And in some cases, it's overlaid with UN sanctions as well. And not only that, but with a whole host of other types of regulations, export controls and anti-money laundering regulations and so on. And this has really been exacerbated by the US's use of extraterritorial sanctions and the maximum pressure campaign, of course, that was employed by the Trump presidency. And I think here there's a really important point to make, which that those narratives were very much based on the idea that by inflicting really serious economic damage on a country, it might translate to some kind of political gain. The reality, however, is that when we look at cases across the world, there's really not that much evidence of this coming about. We can argue that, of course, that there may be some examples, but it's really difficult to demonstrate cause and effect here. And so we have this problem, of course, now of de-risking over-compliance. And in the Russian case, we see the flight of thousands of companies from the country, as my friends and colleagues have already outlined. But this is also included things like remittance platforms, which are used by diaspora groups within Russia and elsewhere to send money to other countries in Central Asia and so on. The flight of financial institutions, technology firms, even food companies and pharma companies trading in non-essential medicines. So what we're seeing here is something quite unprecedented in terms of this mass voluntary boycott. And this is where we start to lose control a little bit, I would argue, of the impacts of the sanctions and their intended or unintended consequences. And here on the exemptions, I think I'm glad you mentioned this, because there's a lot of work that's being done at the moment by the humanitarian community to try and push for aligned exemptions across the different sanctions regimes, the EU, UK, US, Switzerland even, and so on, Canada. For example, the UK hasn't employed any yet. Canadian exemptions don't have a geographical limit, but only Canadian agencies can apply for licenses. The EU exemptions are considered to be too narrow at the moment. They're only applicable in Ukraine and covering UN, ICRC, and IFRC, and not the wider world and the rest of the region. So this is just a few points where I think it's really important that that we, like Eddie was saying, we come back to as targeted as possible use of these measures to really try and pinpoint areas where political change can be brought around in some way over and above the punitive function of the measure.
Mm-hmm. You know, one item that was brought up earlier in the conversation that I want to bring us back to now, switching gears a little bit, is this question of alternative payment rails. You know, we have seen some evidence that Russia is trying to do this. We obviously know when we look more broadly across the globe, what's happening in Russia is creating significant incentives for other countries to try to develop alternative rails for payments, alternatives to the US dollar. There's clearly a question about, in the short term, whether any of that is realistic or possible. But over the long term, what are we thinking in terms of those sorts of incentives? How realistic is it for these sorts of financial rails to be developed, given the role of the dollar and the euro in international trade? You know, you've got plenty of countries who aren't just going to switch to using alternative currencies, and they are the major economic players, with the notable exception of China, of course. And so how do we start to think through those long-term strategic incentives that we're now creating through a massive sanctions regime on a G20 economy? And Alina, I'd like to go to you first on that question for your thoughts.
Well, I think we should not take it lightly, even though that's, you know, there are a few risks, immediate risks to the dollar's sort of a global supremacy in the near term. As we'll remember, historically, you know, tides shift, and what we saw in pound being the leader, over time, as the institutions in the US strengthened and people found that they trust Federal Reserve more, the markets moved to the dollar. And something similar can happen partially on the fringes in the beginning, and then of course over time can erode the whole system. We've seen a lot of research done on the weaponization of networks, right? You know, when we have the central node, it gives the opportunity to weaponize that network, and therefore arguments could be made that maybe more decentralized weapons, networks, while maybe less efficient, but that potentially help countries protect themselves better from one of the centralized node using that excessive power. So there could also be not just the shift from the dollar towards something else, but there could be a shift in the way we're thinking about this global network. That said, Russia, of course, has the domestic financial system, the financial messaging system and the cards, and then is trying to use their money to rubles and renminbi to trade with their partners and rupee. But we have seen recently in the news that Sberbank, due to sanctions, had difficulties transacting in these currencies. So even though that they're trying to do it directly, eventually most of the markets for now come via dollar. And I think that gives the countries that are against the war in Ukraine time to prepare and think through what Russia can possibly do, what are the likely directions that to be working towards, and therefore prepare ourselves and try to block those potential loopholes from opening up before they even have time to develop them.
Yeah. And staying on this theme for a moment of how other countries are looking at the sanctions regimes, obviously we've talked a lot about key Asian allies, Europe, the United States, Russia. There are a lot of other countries in the world. One of our colleagues at CNAS, I think, aptly described these countries as the messy middle. There are countries like India, there are countries in Latin America and Africa who are looking at this heavy sanctions regime, and they're not picking sides here. They're trying to stay out of this conversation, this debate, this conflict to the extent that they can. How should the United States be thinking about that from a foreign policy perspective? You know, we knew that China was never going to be supportive of these sanctions, of course, but I think there's countries like India where I think there's a lot of disappointment, candidly, in the policy community that they are staying on the sidelines. And we can talk, obviously, about the reasons why in terms of their trade relationships, their defense relationships, et cetera. But it does kind of create this weird disconnect now where we have countries that we are trying to really forge much closer, deeper strategic ties with. And yet they're in this messy middle. And so how do we think about balancing those broader dynamics, both in the Russia context, but as we think about using the sanctions tool in other contexts as well, where you've got a big chunk of the world that's just saying, no thanks, we want nothing to do with that. So Eddie, why don't you answer that easy one for us?
Wow, yeah, that's a tough one. I think that the Biden administration deserves tremendous credit for building the sort of coalition of the willing that it was able to build for the Russia sanctions this time around. And I think the important thing is to note that what the Biden administration has been able to do is really unusual, right? So the fact that we're even able to get the EU on board and get, countries, our East Asian allies on board, that's not sort of the norm, right? So to me, the idea that India or Turkey or the countries in the messy middle who are sort of, even a country like India, the U.S. has invested a tremendous amount in our relationship. I guess I never really expected them to be on board with sanctions, and that doesn't bother me all that much, even if I were to put my policymaker hat back on, just because, you can't really, as great as it would be to have, India on board with sanctions, I don't even know what India's domestic sanctions implementation capacity is like, right? So I think we need to be reasonable about that. And I think that gets to my more important point, which is that multilateralism, when it comes to sanctions, when we're talking about U.S. sanctions, in my view, is most significant for its symbolic, on the symbolic aspect, right? It's sending a message that these sanctions are legitimate, that they are, you're enforcing a norm. But in terms of actually like the practical impact of the sanctions, because of the reach and significance of the U.S. financial system and U.S. financial infrastructure, you don't really need, India, Turkey, et cetera, to be on board with the sanctions in order for them to have effect. And I think this is a really important point because if we're sitting around all day hoping that India and Turkey are going to join the sanctions coalition, it's just never going to happen, right? So if we view it as a problem that India and Turkey and others in the messy middle continue to transact with Russia, we have mechanisms that we can use to make that harder, be that secondary financial sanctions, and other measures where, you actually give, you increase the risk premium for a country like India in terms of dealing with Russia, right? The reason they're dealing with Russia right now is they don't see any financial consequence. In fact, they're benefiting from buying cheap Russian oil, right? And the Indians are driving a pretty hard bargain with the Russians right now, asking for $70 a barrel oil. But I think if you injected a bit of risk premium into that by even getting serious about imposing secondary financial sanctions, it might change the calculus of Indians. And by the way, this is what we did in the Iran context too, right? It wasn't like India and China had their own sanctions against Iran. They complied with U.S. secondary sanctions, not necessarily because they thought our policy goals were the right ones, but because they thought that it was in their financial interest to do so.
Mm-hmm. Rachel, I do want to bring you in on this one as well. Obviously, when we talk about messy middle and the rest of the world, some of the key countries that we are actually worried about that we haven't talked about yet are the major oil producers. And so how do we think about the role of the energy sector and the fact that many of those major producers are going to be in this messy middle? They're not going to be participating in sanctions in the future. In fact, some of them are heavily sanctioned entities. And so how do we think about those dynamics for that particular sector moving forward?
Yeah, and I might add, some of the energy producers, particularly in the Gulf, also play an important role potentially on the financial and sort of haven side of things. I'm thinking particularly of the UAE, where there's sort of been question marks about Russian migration, some of them not sanctioned entities, but there are a variety of ways of sort of trying to think about different jurisdictions along the lines that Eddie just sort of laid out of maybe not expecting countries to be on board, but at least not to directly act and try to evade sanctions, right? And I think there's a lot of countries that are sort of in that sort of gray area, right? I was in Turkey last week and lots of companies trying to think about, well, there's still some legal trade. Where do we go? What do we do? But on the energy side, I think there's sort of two constraints here, right? So one is the sort of the moderate sized oil producers who themselves are sanctioned and constrained, Iran and Venezuela. And the Biden administration in different ways has been reaching out to both of those countries and thinking about what one could do. In Iran's case, it far predates the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the JCPOA, if anything, was always going to be challenging, but the war has actually made it more so, in part because of different actions, even though paradoxically, it should be more in all the countries' interests to do so. I think that there have been a couple ways in which when a large producer is targeted, it sort of it limits the room for maneuver, especially if other supplies are already offline. This is an issue for oil, but it's also been an issue for fertilizers, right? So pre-existing sanctions on Belarusian potash and other fertilizer exports contributed to tightening of fertilizer markets, and then throw in high natural gas prices, which mean that it's harder to produce fertilizers through other channels. So I do think that there some of the lessons learned about what sort of preparation to do and what sort of scramble, which I guess also brings me then towards this issue of what about the few countries that don't have energy restrained by sanctions, but are, maybe being circumspect in providing additional supplies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, elsewhere. And there, I think one of the challenges is the interplay between the conflict, the worries these countries have about the U.S. using and allies using these powers, but also their concerns that there's been underinvestment in the oil and gas industry. And I'm very much a proponent of the energy transition, but we do have to be realistic and pragmatic about what we consume right now, today, and in the coming 5 years. And so I think that we'll see what happens in sort of President Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia and the like. I think Saudi Arabia is really watching to see whether the discounting means that there's more Russian energy supplies on the market, to decide whether they pivot and sell more to Europe while Russia sells more to Asia. But ultimately, they're also worried about risks to their own energy production from threats in the region. And so I think there's a balancing act there, which is going to mean that they are sort of acting much more slowly than I think is ultimately in their own interest, because energy prices are at levels that we should be seeing demand destruction, which is not great for their product. So I think we'll see some, all of this means that when you're targeting a major producer of a key critical commodity, there are limitations or costs to the policies that you're implementing.
I want to move us now to the China question. Hopefully this never happens, but if we ever did find ourselves in a position where there is a strong policy reason to issue sanctions against China at scale, say an invasion of Taiwan is the most likely scenario, that's obviously a massively more complicated situation than what we find ourselves in with Russia today, given that China is the number one trading partner for most countries in the world. It's the United States' largest trading partner, or one of them. And when you think about supply chains, when you think about even the chip sector, there's no way that we can kind of use the same sort of massive levels of technology controls or central bank sanctions and the like without having huge retaliatory effects on our own economies. And so we get into the situation where there's not a lot of asymmetric options available to us. So how do we, in the abstract, in the hypothetical, start thinking about that question? And Alina, I'd like to go to you first, thinking through some of those issues, for example, on central bank sanctions or financial institution sanctions. How complicated would that be? Is it even realistic to think about that? And then I'll welcome Erica's response from the EU perspective, as I anticipate that Europeans are looking at this slightly differently than the United States. But Alina, to you first.
Well, I think, a lot of the measures that were done in 2014 with Russia were unthinkable at the time and unprecedented, or especially such a coordination of measures and putting them all together. It does not mean that we should not prepare. As we discussed here, the communication around sanctions and studies around sanctions and the costs, we will spend much more time now thinking how we should communicate, how we should model the impact, and also how we should compare sanctions versus the alternatives. Sometimes alternative is the active military intervention. That is also costly. Sometimes there isn't an option to do nothing. So I think the key takeaway we have from Russian case is that it's critical to prepare. It's critical to go through the details of financial plumbing, and we've already had some experience with that with Hong Kong case. And it's important to start communicating about objectives, I think, early. Just like in inflation targeting in the 90s, there was a lot of discussion whether constructive ambiguity is good, and then we decided it's destructive ambiguity. I think from this experience in Russia, we might want to decide that it's better to have constructive clarity, communicate objectives clearly, and then it might work better. The case of China will be very different from Russia because we're also starting from a much larger market and much more financially integrated market into the global economy, and particularly with the US. It is almost, I'd say, schizophrenic to what extent you've seen this bipartisan standoff with China in recent years. But at the same time, the private sector has gotten deeper and deeper and deeper, embracing the relationship with China. And I think here also the communication might be critical.
Erica?
Yeah, I think these are excellent points. I think we're looking at almost a new battleground with regard to sanctions involving China. Of course, China adopted its own legislation in recent years, allowing it to impose its own autonomous sanctions, as well as the equivalent of the European Union's blocking statute to protect commercial interests within the country. I think when it comes to sanctions, I always like to think that it's rather like in just war theory. You pick your battles with the adversaries that you think you may have some chance of having an impact, and I think this is very much the case in the China situation. But I agree with Alina that the alternatives need to be carefully considered, and here I think the legitimacy of the tool of sanctions needs to be safeguarded. And we can use the Russian example as a test case in a way. But I think what's really important here is to keep in mind that autonomous sanctions elsewhere in the world outside of the Western world are seen as very controversial. And we were talking before about how to bring in other countries. As Eddie was saying, there aren't necessarily legislative frameworks in many of the non-Western countries that we're talking about to actually make use of the sanctions, although they are actually growing in a number of countries now across Latin America, Middle East, Asia, Africa, and elsewhere. India has used them in the past, but they're not using them now. And I think that the really big key here is how to get some of these big, important regional powers to perhaps not fill commercial gaps or not provide safe havens for assets and so on. But I think all of these countries will be looking very carefully at the Russian case and will have China in mind. But really, I think that this massive over-compliance is emphasizing the impacts of sanctions in any case across the world, because ultimately, not only the extraterritorial reach of the sanctions, but the kind of global reach of them because of the dominance of the US dollar in international financial transactions and so on, mean that it's having a global impact already. And here I've just come back to a final point, which is with this concern over supplies of grain, wheat and corn, for example, and fertilizers, this is becoming an incredibly politicized argument where there's a Russian blockade of grain in ports in and around Odessa, and stocks and cereals and fertilizer being blocked. But at the same time, there are some impacts of sanctions, of course, taking place, and also Russian countermeasures. And I think this is where the strategic messaging of US, the EU and others is incredibly important, and also that steps are taken wherever possible to mitigate the unintended consequences on international communities. In the case of Africa, almost half of the wheat eaten in the continent Africa comes from Ukraine and Russia, and this is a continent where 82 million people are acutely food insecure. So this is where we see some of the reticence, of course, among many countries in the world, thinking about the knock-on effects that are compounding what we've already seen from the pandemic. And I think it will only, time will tell, because the initial impacts are not going to be immediately obvious.
Eddie, I'd like to get your thoughts on this as well. And I'm going to add a slightly different flavor to the question as well, in terms of, when we think about conflicts with major economies, it kind of brings up the question of multilateralism writ large. We've seen this conversation play out in the context of the WTO, in APEC, in ASEAN, in the export control regimes. Many of these systems have been under stress because of the challenges of China's integration into those systems. And now we're at a point where the Russian invasion has broken them in some cases. You've got WTO negotiators who won't even be in the same room as their Russian counterparts. And it's hard to see how you fix an organization in that sort of state. So what does this mean for the rules-based international economic order? Are we moving to a blocked world, a world of plurilateral arrangements? Is multilateralism passé?
I think the short answer, and of course this is an opinion, is yes. That I do think we're moving away from sort of the era of universals, right? Of sort of the goal being to universalize, a liberal economic order. Because I think if you think about the origins of that in the 90s, I think there's a belief that you could kind of divorce economics and politics, right? And that economics sort of existed in its own sort of blissful, apolitical realm, and maybe we felt comfortable with that because we also had this sense that politically countries like China and Russia were heading in a more democratic and liberal direction. But I think that both now, if you look at the U.S. political spectrum, on both the right and the left, I don't think there's that belief is sort of dead, right? And I don't think there's a huge appetite for continuing to integrate China and Russia into the global economy. And I mean, even yesterday we saw, we now see a big legislative initiative, not just to have inward investment restrictions, but outward investment restrictions, and to not allow, U.S. investors to invest in certain technologies in places like China and Russia. So I do think that this sort of the unprecedented sanctions that we've seen against Russia, I don't think have fundamentally changed the story. I think we're kind of headed in that direction anyway, but I do think they've accelerated it, right? They've accelerated what I would call sort of this drive for economic security, right? In the U.S., you see it through like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and drives, to, have supply chains that aren't vulnerable to Chinese disruption. In, Russia and China, you've seen it already since 2014 with building alternative financial infrastructures. And I think that's going to be a big story of the next decade, right? Is how do these blocks form? Of course, there will still be some element of codependence, but in terms of that being the overarching goal of the global economic order, I just think that there's not appetite for that anymore in the US, and I don't believe there's appetite for that in Beijing or Moscow either.
Mm-hmm. I want to get to at least one audience question before our time is up today. So from Elizabeth Jennings in the audience, what would a de-escalation process even look like with Russia in terms of sanctions, export controls, travel bans, et cetera? And importantly, can we expect Ukraine to ever really want the West to lift current economic measures on Russia? And so that raises some really interesting questions around how much Ukraine will be in the driver's seat here. I'll offer one thought on the export control side, which is that it seems highly unlikely that any of those export controls are coming off anytime soon, given the desire to make sure that Russia can't ever do this again as a kind of unstated policy objective. But Alina, why don't I give you first crack at this one?
Well, I think it's important to watch what's happening within the economy. And Eddie just talked about sort of different cross-disciplinary approaches, and economics cannot exist in isolation from foreign policy and from military policy, but also it cannot exist in isolation from social studies, political studies. And I think it's important to watch what's happening in Russia in terms of the trend of moving away from an autocratic regime, I'm going to say, towards totalitarian regime. I'm not saying towards removing of sanctions. And I think this body images of children sort of doing the Z letters, across Russian countries. There's sort of this communal support, or everybody has to express the support for the war. I think these are all little trends that are not going in the right direction. And therefore, it's very hard in this context for us to be talking about the end of the conflict and for Ukraine to be able to agree to any lifting of the sanctions. I think the frozen reserves will be a very disputed subject, because on one hand, some people could say, well, this is the easiest one to return. On the other hand, we have a very strong demand from Ukraine that they would like to see that money being used as reparations. And we have seen examples of reparations, I think, is Iraq, and then, of course, Germany is another example. But they're legally very challenging, and also practically they can be very difficult. So then starting looking at potentially maybe easing up access of Russian banks to global payment system, I think that could be another way of doing it. But as also we have seen in the case of Iran, even when the full easing happens, companies are very slow to come back, and especially after the swinging in the Iran case later on, I think after that almost nobody came back because they learned their lessons. And I think in our lifetimes, we might actually not see full integration of Russia back into the global economy.
All right, Erica, I'll give you the last word before we close.
Thank you. Just to build on what Alina has already said very succinctly, I think this is one of the big challenges in sanctions implementation is when do you ease them, suspend them, lift them, and in reward for what? And in a study that we did here through the Carter Center, actually, we looked at a range of cases from the UN, the US, and the EU, and there's a whole plethora of different ways that sanctions can be eased and suspended in response to different actions. And absolutely, at the moment, there's no appetite for this. But I think in the longer term, it's really important that there is some element of carrots or leverage that's used. Otherwise, we're just going to see another one of these protracted sanctions regimes we have many of already elsewhere in the world, and you'll see continued adaptations within Russia. So I think the key is to combine sanctions with other policy tools as much as possible across the board and as strategically as possible, and to have some insight in place as well.
Thank you, Erica. And thank you to all of our panelists for an excellent conversation. As Eddie mentioned up top, these are issues that we will be unpacking for months and years to come. I look forward to more conversations with this group on exactly those issues. Thank you to our audience. A reminder to please check out our new Sanctions by the Numbers report on Russia, which is now available at CNAS.org. And thank you, as always, to our amazing Energy Economics and Security program and to CNAS Comms. Take care, everyone.